Hi everyone, thanks for joining. It's the I've got half an hour on my clock, so I thought we could get started. I've already hit record as well, so just to let you know that the recording has begun. Um, Thanks all for dialing in for the last session of this. I think we can have a discussion at the end if we wanted to break out and do anything separate from for weeks going forward. But this is the fourth part of the book club, which was the last one that we had planned. So thank you for sticking with us to this point. And yeah, let's begin. I'll start by saying this section was definitely the largest and definitely had the most content in of all of the sections. So I can see why, I'm not sure who gave us the advice at the beginning that part 2 and 4 were definitely the longest, but I definitely agree that this was the chunkiest section. But I found that I definitely got the most out of this section. It felt like there were a lot of really specific things and really like specific advice that you could take into the actual role of being a manager, and further than just the ideas of the breakfast factory or the other ideas that he put forward. This was very specific information. So Sean, I was wondering to pick on you as a co-host, what you got out of the sports analogy section that was the most useful piece for you.
So for the sports analogy chapter, I am quite into sports, which weirdly felt like I didn't get much out of it, because I get to anybody who knows me will not find this a surprise. I got very bogged down in the bits where I was like, well, yeah, but I wouldn't say it's quite like that. I would say it's like probably basically the same, but slightly different. And I just bogged myself down in those situations. So one thing I found interesting, just about sports in general, professional sports, or competitive sports, I guess, if you look at high level amateur competition as well, is how the results are basically everything. Like, it's quite a common theme that you hear, that like, people do care how you play the game, but they won't notice that in the record books at the end of your career. So for a book that's so heavily emphasizing outputs, that's like the ideal scenario, right? Like your output is very clear and very objective to absolutely everybody. Did you win? Did you not win?
Well, the thing that I found quite interesting, and it's something that actually what you said has just put it in my mind, is that the analogy with sports people is that for people who work long hours, they are like it's some kind of sickness or being a workaholic. But for sportsmen who put the same amount of hours in his mind, it's not viewed in such a negative light. But one could argue that for professional sportsmen, if they're putting in long hours, they are a workaholic, because if they don't put in those long hours, they don't essentially get the payoff that comes from winning that tournament or winning that award. And I'm sure that the family of professional sportsmen would view it the same way. That I mean, we just had Wimbledon here, so why can they not get off the court? Why are they still practicing their serve? Why are they still out there? They should be inside having supper with the rest of us. So I think that there was something that I found quite challenging in that comparison, was because it seemed like professional sportsmen were viewed slightly differently.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of goes to a couple of things that I sort of felt like I was going into nitpicking mode, but like sports, I mean, this applies to some people's jobs as well, but like I play sports for fun. Like I am not a workaholic if I play soccer like 3 times a week, because that's not my job, but I would do it anyway because it's fun. So there's that aspect, and there's also the aspect that sports people tend to have very compressed careers. So you might have like under 10 years to like maximize your career, which I think changes the equation quite a lot, as opposed to somebody like me who, I don't want to burn out. Like, whereas for a sports person, that's a lower risk because of the compressed timescale.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, the sports analogy is interesting because it certainly is different today in regards to the fact of if you look at the sports analogy, like one thing that you will know with most professional sports is that they actually spend a lot of time resting. There's well-known well-known players, Tom Brady in football, if you're familiar with American football, he goes to bed every night at 10 o'clock, regardless of the situation. Like he's like, I go to bed at 10 and I get at least 8 hours of sleep. And that's just what I do, because I know that's what I need to do to be successful. The golf tournament this year, the Masters, they basically had an early start, and basically all the players, like as soon as the competition was over for the previous day, they all went to bed because they knew that they were going to have to get up at like they were saying, to prepare, they have to be up 4 to 5 hours ahead of time. And if they have an 8 a.m. start, they have to be up 5 hours. So they have to get up basically at 3 o'clock in the morning. So they were already like, running to bed basically to get some rest associated with it. So I think the aspect that they're talking about is the time devoted to it, which, if you want to be successful at something, you do have to devote time to it. So the question is, when do you consider it a problem versus, actually you just trying to be, more successful things. And every person has a different answer for that. And there's, whenever you make the generalization of it, it generally it causes people to react different ways.
Yeah, for sure. Another piece I found that was quite interesting with the sports analogy is they listed 3 things about if you think of the manager as the coach, and they listed that an ideal coach takes no personal credit, and the second thing is that they are tough on their teams, and that the coach has likely been a player themselves at one point. And the piece that stuck out for me was being tough on the teams, because I can. When you watch those football matches or rugby matches, and you see the way that the coach talks to the players at halftime, sometimes it can actually make you cringe how harsh they're being on the players, but it's what they need to do to get through. And I know for myself, like, my management style is definitely not to be that harsh on as harsh as a coach would be on their team. But this made me think, maybe there's a certain degree of toughness that you actually do have to put forward just to actually get the best out of your teammates.
Yeah. Again, don't want to go too deep into the weeds on sports here, but a common thing in sports in the UK, at least, is that there's not just there's a head coach, but there's also an assistant coach, and quite often that's sort of a good cop, bad cop relationship, for want of a better word. So the head coach retains much more distance from the personal relationships with the team, whereas the assistant is the one who's able to sort of nurture them, and the head coach is much more focused on those harsher interactions, like you mentioned. If anybody's read the book or watched the film The Damned United, that's got a great example of that dynamic, and then what happens when the head coach goes away without having that assistant to sort of soften them, and how it just all falls apart completely.
Yeah, I took the most notes on this section myself. I didn't care for the term tough on their team. I don't think that, personally, I don't think that's helpful in a professional environment. I like the term critical a little bit better. And I think it ties in well to the next section, where it says a given managerial approach is not equally effective under all conditions, right? There may be teams that respond really well to a critical and fairly harsh manager. I know myself, I'm not like that at all. I will push the teams and ask questions. And again, going back to a sports analogy, and it was in, oh crap, I can't remember the name of the book, but they did a profile on Tony Dungy, who was an American football coach, and how relaxed and quiet and confident he was as a coach. And he wasn't those screaming coaches, and he just set expectations for his team. And when they didn't meet those expectations, he would just read it back to them and say, hey, this is what we expect as a team. This is where you're not living up to it. So maybe it's just the wording and it's all saying the same thing, but I like the term critical better than tough. I think tough has a bit of a negative connotation. And also on the third point that Rachel brought up, a good coach was likely a good player himself at one time. I'm not sure about that. A lot of coaches, especially in American sports, they were okay players at the time, and they did a lot of learning while they were on the bench, observing the team, and I don't know how to draw that analogy here. I certainly always respected managers when I was early in my career that had been in the trenches before and been doing what I'd been doing. And I struggled with those that didn't understand what I was saying to them. So,
yeah, that's also a pattern in the UK where it's sort of a a cliche that if the coach was too talented a player, they just can't coach other players effectively because they're just like, well, this is easy. Like, you know, it's
why aren't you doing it?
Yeah, like you just take the play and you do exactly the right thing at the right time, and then it's done. Like, easy. So yeah, I think having someone who's had to work is important, not just having someone who was good through whatever you want to call talent or whatever.
Yeah, and I think the point about an ideal coach takes no personal credit for the success of his team. That's critical to being a successful manager, right? Letting your team bask in the glory, and on the flip side, calling them out when they're not living up to the expectations and making sure their expectations are well known and everybody understands the same thing. So I like this section of the book. I thought it was great.
And I also liked the way that what you said there tied into a later chapter about how you can't give a manager a better performance review than what their team got, because ultimately the manager's output is whatever the team outputs. And if the team's not being successful, then how can you give the manager a good review as a result of that? And I think that's also what I liked about the section, is it feels like everything hung together throughout it. Like each of these different chapters were different portions of the same concepts that he was trying to put forward. So moving on to the next, the next chapter was all about task relevant maturity. I didn't put a lot of notes in this section, but I think that what I really got from it was, you know, that the manager's most important responsibility is to get the top performance out of the people on their team. And of all of the things that come and go through each day, that come and go out of your inbox, you know, that it definitely feels that sometimes this can get lost in amongst all of the other things that come up that managers need to deal with. At the end of the day, you have to get good performance out of everyone.
Yeah, this section, when they talked about task relevant maturity and how low TRM requires higher structure and higher task relevant maturity requires lower structure, it reminded me of a book or training that I took about situational leadership, which is a tool, and I've seen wielded poorly when management tended towards one or the other on everything, right? If they had a highly functional team and they thought it required high structure, then the team got frustrated by micromanagement. Or if you had a relatively immature team and you just kind of let them go without giving them a lot of structure, they would flounder, right? So it's tricky to find that balance. And I thought this section of the book was a little better worded than I found the situational leadership training. I thought situational leadership training was a bit binary. They're either one or the other, and there was a lack of nuance. And I thought they did a good job of covering the nuance in this section.
I really like the example they had there of like switching managers around teams, and they found that like they could switch like a high output manager to a lower output group or whatever, and like you lose the output from both a lot of the time when you do that. Like the high output comes from the combination of the manager and the team, not one or the other exclusively. I also really liked how this fed into not the title, but also the chapter later on about compensation as task relevant feedback, because I think if you're thinking about things in terms of task relevance, those two dovetail really nicely.
Yeah, I also thought too, I liked in this section where they talked about the presence or absence of monitoring is really important when it comes to delegating a task, and just a reminder on, you know, being sure that everyone knows what's expected of them and you're monitoring progress along the way.
Yeah, I made a note about having to work up to monitoring, which is mentioned in the book as well, because like it does say you can't just start with that, but that's where you want to end up. There was also a note I've made here, which I haven't quoted exactly, which was interesting to me, which was that when it was talking about communicating, getting ideas from your head into somebody else's head, and how when they surveyed supervisors and their reports about how communicative the supervisor's style was, basically, I think it was 90% of supervisors saw their style as more communicative than their reports did, which was interesting to me, I guess, because we all have a lot of context about what's inside our own head that we can't, no matter how much we try, get out to people all the time.
Well, what I also liked about that is that I think in that specific case, they were also saying how the subordinate felt that the helpful suggestion was actually a direct instruction that you will do this like this. Meanwhile, the manager had not intended it like that at all. And I think that can also be quite hard for a manager to put it forward as this is a helpful suggestion. You don't have to do it like this. And yeah, how to put that message out there but have it received in that way can also be a challenge. But there was another piece about, and I've quoted it here, a manager's ability to operate in a style based on communication and mutual understanding depends on there being time for it. And I think that in a sense that being able to give a person an instruction that is just a suggestion, a helpful suggestion, not a direct directive, also depends on how much mutual understanding you have with that person. If you haven't spent a lot of time in one-on-ones and you haven't spent a lot of time creating the right environment with that person, they're not going to accept the messages that you're giving in the same way that you think they're going to be accepted. So was there any other thoughts that people had about the task relevant maturity section? So, because if not, we can jump into the performance appraisal section, which is, I think, where I got the most out of this whole section. I don't see any thumbs down, so we'll press on to here. So what I've said here is the thing that I found most interesting was his preference was actually to do an async review prior to actually giving the feedback, and I found that interesting because obviously that's how we do things here, and the huge focus being on async. And I also liked how he said it gives people time to react or overreact before actually having the meeting. And I hadn't thought about that. It definitely gives some people to react. It was the overreacting part that I hadn't considered really. So.
Yeah, this is actually something I've always done with my reports, is give them the review beforehand so they could come prepared, because I don't know, when I got them and in the moment I always felt blindsided. You're basically reading it out to you and you're not able to absorb it and kind of give real feedback, and it's gone mostly well. There's been one or two that didn't go well, and there was some screaming involved, usually by them because they didn't like the way I worded something, but I felt that giving the review in advance was very helpful.
Yeah, a couple of things I really liked here on the assessing side were, first of all, talking about assessing the performance, not the potential, because until that potential is realized, that's the point you should assess it. But also there was a couple of things about timescales where, first of all, you have to recognize that the output of work done might have an offset. So for instance, at GitLab, under our previous release process, what someone did 1 month might not be visible until the next month or 6 weeks later, depending on where you fell in the period. Also I think there's an example about a factory's productivity, which again, big physical process with a lot of moving parts is gonna take a while to detect. But also when someone's working on something a long-term project, trying to use a sort of present value for whatever you consider that long-term project to be, so you don't over or underweight it, underweight it because it hasn't provided too much value yet, or overweight it because it will provide huge value in the end, but try and assess that at the current point. I found both of those really useful, that I will definitely take into account in future.
And also when thinking about all of those things that you're assessing, both the things that have the immediate benefit and the ones where you're waiting for the long-term benefit, jotting, I like the fact of jotting all of those things down that you observe and then connecting all of those pieces up into messages. Because I think earlier in my career, I would provide so many messages that people would not necessarily absorb everything. And it was nice to see it actually called out here that just concentrate on the most important messages, because you don't have to get everything across. You just have to improve their performance by getting the most important things addressed. And in actual fact, some people just aren't capable of taking in everything in a review. I like that statement. Another thing that he went on to talk about was the 3 L's, to level and listen and then leave yourself out. And I was actually struggling a little bit to figure out what the leave yourself out meant, but I appreciated the example that he provided there about how in one review he kept talking and kept talking and kept talking, and then afterwards figured out that he was just embarrassed about it, and that's why he kept talking. So it was nice to have the example provided there.
Yeah, one thing that I liked about this section too was a reminder around total listening. And to Craig's point, if you're delivering the review beforehand, in your mind, when you're giving the review, you've got specific things that you've thought through. You've thought through how you're going to say it, what you're going to say, what they could potentially be saying back to you. And now they've done the same thing too. So really kind of that total listening is something that I'm really going to practice. That's really hard for me too, because we have all these ways that people can ping you. And so a reminder of turning off notifications and really feeling like you're focused. It's easy when you're locked in a room together or in a room together. But when you're giving a virtual, that was just a reminder, like, what does total listening actually mean in a remote company? I think is different.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because giving feedback to someone on a video chat is completely different from being shut in a room with someone where you can actually see if they're checking their phone or doing something different, or distracted because there's the dog barking in the background, or whatever else has got their attention, or your attention for that matter. And I think that the last thing that I really got out of this was sometimes there's such an emphasis about focusing on underperformers that not enough is done to improve the performance of the stars. And I like that he called out that we should spend time trying to improve the stars. That was like a very specific point that he made. Yeah, I like that. One
thing that I also liked too was where they were talking about, the purpose of the review is not to cleanse your system, like get everything off your chest on, how the person is doing and what you've observed throughout the year. And it's really to improve this person's specific performance, which I think going back to highlighting the things that you've noticed throughout the year and then kind of breaking those out into 3, potentially maximum of 3 areas is important.
So with that, like from our perspective now, after reading this book, and hopefully other managers have the same perspective, like the point of a performance review is to improve someone's performance. But how do you effectively say that to the person who is being reviewed? Like, the main goal of this meeting is to improve your performance. How do you make sure that someone actually sees that that's what a performance review is? Because to some people, a performance review is, it's that time of year when they see how my work's gone and if I should get a raise or not. How can you actually frame it in the sense of this is just about performance?
I don't think I feel like it is the goal, like from the organizational perspective, but I don't think that's the only purpose it has from the perspective of someone receiving the performance review. So I think that might be where the disconnect is. Like, they will get value out of that performance review for themselves. Like, that might not improve their performance, but might, be valuable to them overall in their career. And I think that might be part of the tension there, right? Like, because the book is focused on output specifically.
I don't know if it directly answers your question or not, Rachel, but I liked the comment in there about having the employee do a self-review. And I don't know if they called it out specifically, but I always ask all my direct reports to track their accomplishments, no matter how small they think it is, so we can review at the end of the year and then make sure to track things they thought they could have done better as well. Because I always tell them there's something I'm going to miss. I want to make sure that your performance is recorded and you feel comfortable with it. You're proud of your accomplishments, and we talk about where you think you need to improve as well. So it's their participation. I've never specifically called it out the way you put it, Rachel, that this is about how we continue to improve your performance. But I think explicitly stating it's probably the simplest way, so that they don't feel like it's a dreadful thing where they're being judged once a year. It's all about improving performance.
It feels like that is very direct. It's a very direct way of going about saying this meeting is to improve your performance. And sometimes that, that doesn't go down well either with a management style or with particular people. But I like what you've said there about, people have to be comfortable that what you're putting forward is a correct recording of what they accomplished this year. And yes, ultimately we as managers would like to see everything, but we will miss things, and it would be great if they sort of help along the way to make sure that those things don't get missed. Any other thoughts on performance appraisals? Okay, so then the chapter about 2 difficult tasks, interviewing and dealing with someone leaving. I think it's fair to say that at the moment interviewing seems to be the far larger thing on people's mind, given how many interviews people have been doing lately and how fast we're growing. And for me, the best quote, careful interviewing doesn't guarantee you anything. It merely increases your odds of getting lucky. And also, again, appreciated the specific example he gave about the one hire, that it was a disaster. And no matter how much he went through his notes, he couldn't find out why he hadn't caught it.
Yeah, I think one thing that I liked about this section too was, if people are rambling on when you've given them a question, they ramble on about the answer, feel empowered to, course correct and bring that question to a close, because, you only have a certain amount of time. And if you notice them rambling, you need to bring them back on track to make the most out of that 45 minutes or hour long time.
I've been part of an interview, well, I was the interviewee in this case. I've been in an interview like that where they weren't getting the answers that they needed from me, and they were cutting me off quite abruptly and saying, no, let's talk about this thing or that thing. And as the interviewee, I actually only found it uncomfortable the first 1 or 2 times, and then I got into the fact that if I'm not giving them the answer, they're going to redirect me, and that's fine. I thought that I'd feel much more uncomfortable for much longer, but really you get into it quite quickly. And I think from the interviewer's perspective, it helps a lot because you only have a certain amount of time to go through a whole lot of questions and find out a whole lot of history from this person.
I know in my case, I tell people up front, this is a survey interview, so I'm going to cover a lot of topics. I'm going to bounce around. I'm going to go one topic to the next. Don't treat it as anything more than I'm just moving on. And, I try to give them a rough idea of, I've got 10 questions here to try to give them a feel for, okay, like if I'm taking 20 minutes for a question, that's not going to measure up if we want to get through that much of a range in the time frame. But it still doesn't prevent the fact that folks do occasionally ramble, and you have to kind of direct them in that regard.
I've never actually said this to somebody, but I have redirected people quite a lot. And maybe I should start saying it, is the reason I'm redirecting you is because I want to know about this thing. And if I don't get information about this thing, I can't say oh, you did well on this or whatever, because I don't know. So that's the whole point of this. It's not to keep people off balance. It's so that I actually get the information I'm looking for out of the interview.
Yeah, if you look at our must-haves in most organizations, which you'll find is there's quite a number of them, and to actually cover, obviously not every interview has to cover all the must-haves, but to even cover a subset of those, it actually makes you have to think very quickly or move very quickly through it for a given candidate. So it's definitely interesting in regards to the fact of brevity is definitely the thing you want in this situation.
Yeah, I think I definitely sort of view giving that feedback, like you mentioned, Sean, of the explanation as to why as an element of transparency and something that you want to give to people. When you ask someone to focus on a particular area of a question and then you explain very briefly why that is, it's really helpful, and it helps the candidate recognize that you're actually interested in them being successful, in the interview if possible. So I always have tried to do that in my.
And essentially, if the candidates already got through the CV screening and they've got through the screening phone call, by the time they're actually talking to you, we already have an investment in the candidate to try and get them successfully through the interview process. And so at that point, you're actually looking for people to succeed the process, not to fail out. So that from that section, I also liked direct questions being getting direct answers, and that I must admit would take me completely by surprise in an interview if someone asked something that was that direct. But I can see how that would give very direct answers, because you don't really have time to think about a nice way of phrasing it or a different way of coming across. You'll probably say the first thing that comes to mind. And the question that I'm referring to was when he asked a candidate, like, are you good technically? I don't like. How do you respond to that quickly? I thought that was interesting. I'm not sure if I'd actually do it in an interview, but it was an interesting idea.
I actually had a candidate tell me once they were top 10, and I clarified, what does that mean, top 10%? And they were referring to Portland. He goes, no, I'm a top 10 developer in Portland. So he clearly didn't have a problem with direct feedback, and we didn't hire him because he was not.
Is that going back to the sports thing where they'd set up some kind of league? Or
They apparently had an eliminator that I wasn't a part of. Maybe they didn't qualify.
Hacker Rank has that already, doesn't it? So maybe that's where it's based on.
So moving off of the interview section was to the more challenging section about people quitting. And yeah, hopefully we won't be dealing with this too much, but it is a useful thing to have in one's toolkit. And I like that he called out that your initial reaction to this is so critical, because yes, it is something that's so uncomfortable that people usually just want to say, okay, I'll talk to you later. And it's so important to actually listen to what they've got to say before just running off to whatever the next thing is. But yes, that statement of, do you just have a minute for me, is always, always makes my heart stop just a little bit. What's coming next? And I also like that they said, get them to talk through the prepared points, because they've practiced the prepared points a lot. And that's all the stuff that they've actually prepared, but there's probably a whole bunch of real reasons that if you ask them enough, that those real reasons would come out, and those are actually the things that need to be addressed, not the prepared points that usually come forward.
Yeah, I thought the section where he was talking about, reminding the employee that they have two commitments. So they made a commitment to you to take the job and to do the job, and then also, to the future employer. I don't know that I necessarily, I was just kind of trying to think about like myself in those situations. And I don't know that I would necessarily be comfortable immediately having those discussions with, the person who I was resigning to, or, but so I don't know. Did anybody else like catch that section?
I did feel a little bit cringy when they were talking about like this is two commitments, because that feels a little bit like it feels a little bit like emotional manipulation, but that sounds a little bit harsh when I say it like that. But as soon as you start to use the word commitment, it elicits a response from people, and I don't know if I'd necessarily use the same approach there. I'd focus much more on trying to fix, like, what can we do to fix this? Like, how can we keep you, not making them feel guilty for wanting to leave.
Yeah, and I know another stat, and this number's probably not accurate, so don't 100% quote me, but like 60% of people, if they've quit once and you offer them to stay, they end up leaving within 6 to 9 months anyways. So I'm not sure I think it's very situational. So like we can't make broad brush comments about people quitting and how we would handle those situations. And he's just giving a guideline for things to think about and what you could potentially do.
This is the one place where the book is probably a little dated in regards to, he started at Intel. I think it was his first company back in the 70s. He published this book in 99 or 96. The world's changed a lot in the last 20 years, and changed a lot between the 70s and the 90s. It changed even more between the 90s and the 10s, essentially, would be my assessment. And the world's a very different place in regards to that, as far as the tenure of an employee, expectations around where you expect the company to be in 20 years, say, for instance. So it's a very different mindset in my book.
Yeah, I mean, we all work for a company that hasn't been around for 20 years to start with, which obviously adds a bit of context on the other side of that equation, right? one thing I really liked about this as well was, which is something I think probably has occurred to me before, but never like as a major thing, is like the impact it has on other people who see that person quitting, like the sort of downstream effects of that. I thought that was, it didn't spend a lot of time on it, but that part really stuck with me.
What I also enjoyed was he talked about, I don't know the exact words that he used, but about saving the employee for the company, even if it meant that they left your team. And at a previous company, that was a huge thing, was if a person is not happy, just try and get them to change the team. Like changing a team is the most favorable outcome of this, if the alternative is for them to leave. And as a result, they actually had such a big push on advertising jobs internally, and it was part of the conversation in one-on-ones about if there were different teams that people wanted to explore. And it did strike me a little bit with all of the vacancies that we had at one point, that I felt that I'm not sure if maybe it was different in other teams, but that there could have been more discussion around getting people to go into different teams, just because they might grow, the individuals might grow in different ways by being on a different team and learning a different thing.
The one thing I will say is that senior leadership levels, in most companies, you will find that there's more of a commitment-oriented kind of mindset around things. That's usually not to say that employees are around forever, but they do kind of think in terms of, okay, if you're going to come here, expect to be here for some period of time and see things through, even thick and thin situations. But so he may be talking more about that senior leadership level in those contexts as well. Go ahead, sorry, Rachel.
So just to clarify, do you mean that when people arrive in a company in a senior leadership position, that the intention is that they will stay around for a while to see through either the initiatives that they put in? The intention is not to arrive and then jump around.
Correct. That like typically what you'll see is you'll see like, hey, I'm coming in to do a specific thing, and it's not like a year commitment. It's like more like a 3 to let's say 2 to 4 year commitment, right? Or even a 3 to 5 year commitment. And the thought process around it is generally, as you get to the more senior levels, particularly in larger organizations, it's much harder to turn the ship in different directions, right? Because of that, that's the thought process associated with this. Is I'm here for the long haul, and I'm willing to deal with the ins and outs of the situation.
I think it might also be that when you get into the senior leadership positions, from what it looks like on your CV as well, if you jump into an organization and you don't wait long enough to see the ship change direction, it will read oddly on your CV to have landed in one position and then just quickly leave. So I suppose it's also in an individual's best interest to stay around, just so that continuity comes across well on the CV.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why we look at longevity when we're looking at employees, because we want to understand, hey, if they view every job as a 9-month stint, they're going to treat the situation very differently than if they are going to be around for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think the comment that I was making about encouraging people to move between teams was more from an individual contributor and not at a director level point of view, and also sometimes moving between job roles as well. So perhaps it's someone changing between an analyst and a controller, or changing between testing and development, or I'm not familiar with all of the ins and outs of marketing and sales departments. I'm not sure what all the little niche pieces in that might be, but making those changes if people are interested in making those changes for themselves.
Yeah, those definitely should be encouraged. Absolutely.
That's also the type of thing that's mentioned in the next chapter, like at the end, where it talks about like people being over promoted, and then the idea of recycling them. So like you can. It's not just like you promote someone to the level of like where they can no longer do a good job and then you fire them because they're not doing a good job, but you find a way to like try and make them effective within the organization and keep them within the organization at that point. So obviously that's a slightly different scenario, but I think it's the same sort of process.
Yeah, to be honest, out of the next section, I didn't really get that much from it as well, because it was about so that the next section was compensation as task relevant feedback. Because I feel, again, maybe this is something to do with the fact that the world has changed, but it feels like all of the roles in all of the companies that I've been in, that this is a pretty standard way of functioning. And yes, I didn't feel like I got a huge amount out of it. And just the note that I wrote down was about just being honest about the performance rating and having it connected to an honest merit-based compensation is what makes companies, or what makes people successful. So I'm not sure if there's much that people wanted to discuss on that chapter. So also, given that we have 5 minutes, I thought it would be interesting to just talk a little bit about the training section before wrapping up. And from the training section, I like that he said that training is a process, not just an event.
Yeah, there are a couple of things here for me. First of all, the iteration he suggests, where like you start with like basically a throwaway training session where you're learning more than the people who are in the training session probably, and that you do that with the more knowledgeable people who report to you, because they won't be damaged as badly by you doing the training session in a not great way. I thought it was quite an interestingly humble way of putting that, but also how high leverage training is, sort of going back to some of the earlier chapters, like that it is a really important activity. I know at GitLab, Eric Johnson, who's the VP of engineering, did spend some time with me and some other backend managers not long after he joined, sort of training us on specific topics, specifically around hiring, which helped a lot. And I sort of see that made this section of the book made me think of that, and how, like, you know, that was a way to increase leverage.
I also like that he called out that his training repertoire was largely the managerial aspects of his role and the leadership aspects of his role, and that he recognized that he was too far out of date now to teach the technical material. Because when I started reading the chapter, I thought there is no ways that I could teach the people on the Geo team about half of the things that they're doing, because I'm not as current as they are with certain things anymore. And it was nice for him to call out that the things that he's most current on are the things that he does every day, being the management and the leadership aspects of things. Yeah. Well, if there are no further thoughts on the chapter, I wanted to wrap up and say thank you very much for everyone for taking the time to join this. We're going to be sending out a survey. There's a link that is already in the agenda document if you'd like to follow that. I think that there are other people in the company who are interested in running other book clubs, and hopefully the information that we gather will help them tailor future book clubs differently to what people have enjoyed or not enjoyed. But yeah, just wanted to thank you very much, and also thank you to Sean for reaching out and encouraging me to do this with him. I've quite enjoyed having a second person on the call that is doing this with me, and not at all being up to him or to me to do all of it. So thank you very much, Sean, for that.
Thanks, Rachel. I think I've learned a lot from this, which is a selfish goal, but it worked for me.
Just one quick question for y'all on the survey. Are we just, I see there's 4 questions. Are we just supposed to put the answers in a comment?
Sorry, that was just a link to the issue. Like, people should be able to set it up in Culture Amp, so we'll get Culture Amp to email it out to people. So that's just where we're discussing what questions we're going to ask and then figuring out the logistics of it.
Great. So you'll send us an email?
Yeah, we'll call you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for setting this up. It's been great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hope you enjoy the rest of your days.
Likewise.
And I'll put the recording up later today.
See y'all.
Everybody.